The first positive I have to say about Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, the game for the Sega Genesis, is that each Ranger has their own unique sprite set and resembles the way they did in the television show. So, in other words, no palette swapped Red Ranger or disproportionate steroid Rangers to be found here. And thank God for that! Of course, they all fight pretty much the same way, with perhaps a couple unique moves among them, at best, and they all share the same voice depending on the gender, but it's still a far cry from what we got the first time on Genesis and even on the Super Nintendo offerings. So with that out of the way, let's begin the review proper of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, the game for Sega Genesis, and I will spare you the use of that particular title and just go with the proper title, so let's just keep going. Now, much like the first batch of Power Ranger video games released in 1994, Sega developed and published games based on the Power Rangers movie for both the Genesis and the Game Gear, thankfully sparing us another Sega CD outing of horrible full-motion video gaming comprising QuickTime events over recycled TV footage that looks far worse than whatever you'd find on YouTube. While Bandai delivered the goods for Super Nintendo and Game Boy. While the Game Gear version of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie is virtually the same game as its predecessor, the Genesis iteration veers away from the one-on-one fighting genre and goes for a traditional side-scrolling beat-em-up akin to Final Fight or Sega's own Streets of Rage series. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie features the Rangers fending off against the forces of Ivan Ooze and preventing his takeover of the world. Unlike the Super Nintendo version of the same name, which has very little to do with the actual movie outside of the titular villain, Ivan Ooze being the final boss of the game, the Genesis iteration of Power Rangers the movie does attempt to follow the movie a lot more closely, by having you fight Oozemen and Ectomorphic and Titans, which were enemies featured from the movie and not featured in the Super Nintendo version, by the way. However, the game skips over most of the movie and just portrays the Ranger fights. The entire middle portion of the movie has been depicted in cutscenes. To make up for this fact, however, there is a scene in the game where the three new Rangers at the time, Rocky, Aisha, Adam, reminisce about how they first started, resulting in a flashback and a couple levels taking place during the second season of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I'll admit that this is a rather nice way of tying the TV show to the movie, which normally has nothing to do with each other as far as continuity goes, and it does give some excuse to shoehorn putties and fights with Goldar and other monsters into the game. Although I was initially thrilled about having the prospect of reliving TV show episodes in the game entitled Mighty Morphin Power Rangers The Movie, after my experiences with the Super Nintendo game of the same name. Eventually it grew on me, it didn't really bother me as much, and in fairness, the Game Gear version also did the same thing, albeit in a different fashion, but still the same deal. Whereas the previous Sega offerings had rather generic and unimpressive soundtrack, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie takes its cues from the TV show by recreating some of the classic Ron Wasserman fight music into Genesis themes. And all in all, the sounds are rather respectful renditions of the TV show soundtrack and pretty good in their own right, which is a step above the previous Genesis offering. The rendition of the classic Go-Go Power Rangers theme song is still rather weak, in my opinion. But in fairness, it's actually a pretty decent rendition, and it's a far better rendition than what was available in the first Power Rangers game on Genesis, which was god-f***ing awful. So what's the gameplay like? Well, like I said, it's a beat-em-up akin to Streets of Rage or Final Fight. You have several moves, including a generic life-draining special move, a unique special move that is done by charging your attack button, and your usual assortment of basic punch-kick combo attacks and grapple moves. Nothing too fancy here. For the most part, your main opponents will be Oozemen and Putty Patrollers. On occasion, Goldar will swoop down and beat you up a bit. You could always return the favor, and at the end of most levels, you'll face a boss, beat him, and face him again in your Megazord. The availability of swords depends on the scenario taking place. You have no lives count, only limited continues, but you can gain lots of lives and more continues by collecting power coins that will pop out at times depending on whether, at times. It usually appears at the same time, so it doesn't really matter. Other than that, it's your typical side-scrolling beat-em-up. There's destructible environments, the occasional passing car you have to avoid lest you want to get killed, or at least heavily damaged. Meteors you have to avoid, and a hidden fight with Lord Zed, but it's typical beat-em-up fare. The game is a bit on the easy side. It doesn't really get challenging unless you set the difficulty to hard, and even then you probably lose a continue or two at worst before beating the game in no time. With only 6 levels, it's a fairly quick game, so chances are you should beat this in less than an hour or so. If that. Now, I've heard opinions, people saying that this is probably the best of the Mighty Morphin offerings that you can find. Indeed, it probably has some claim to that. Sticks to the source material, easy to get into, fun time with a second player. However, I'd have to say that this is probably the second best Mighty Morphin offering. The best offering of the early Mighty Morphin Power Rangers games, in my opinion at least, happened to be the first Game Gear release, as it's a rather slick and enjoyable game to play. but that would be harder to come across and probably harder to play for long periods considering the Game Gear's reputation as a power sucker. Still, despite that, this game, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie, for the Genesis, is probably as close as you're going to get to a Power Rangers game that captures the feel and essence of the television series, if not the movie, and for that, it's worth a shot if you're a fan of this show.